My name is Dave Morrow. 9 months of each year, I live in the wild, surrounding me in all directions, thousands of miles of pure wilderness. No roads, no people, no internet, no photography hotspots or social media likes, no top 10 tips to help you out. These things don't matter here. They never did and never will. I come here to challenge my fears and improve my craft, landscape photography. My backpack is filled with 2 weeks of food, camera gear and tripod, a shelter, a topo map and compass, and a GoPro to document the experience. I travel by foot. This is all I need. This series teaches my entire image creation process, the constant struggle to learn and improve, the drive to solve problems and create better photographs. My goal is to teach you what I know and the path used to get there. I challenge you to abandon the herd, leave the hive, think for yourself, stop chasing internet fame, followers, and likes, blaze a new trail, create new ideas, teach others your path, devote every second to your craft. So thanks for watching, and welcome to the Wilderness Photography Expeditions. So we are out on day one of a 6-day backpacking and photography trip, taking up this 50-mile long river. That source lies out in the middle of a huge wilderness. So think of like a vast swath of old growth forest, trees 1,500 to 2,000 years old, and it's probably about 350 miles across. In the center of that, there are 8,000 to 9,000 foot glaciated peaks. So all that glacier melt feeds these rivers, and they also just happen to be so wet that they're the perfect environment for temperate rainforest. So what I'm walking through right now is ancient forest, and our goal is just to make it up this river far enough, set up a base camp, and then we'll do a bunch of day hikes out to explore this specific area. We'll move our tent again and then kind of repeat the process. So hopefully we'll get some pretty good shooting done, make some videos as well. But it's a perfect stretch of weather to be out here. Sunny, pretty warm, nice intermittent light coming through the forest. Can't really beat it. So I just put my bag down and we're gonna stop and have coffee and eat lunch real quick, but also looking for some compositions in this really nice grove of trees. Everything's kind of just like flat, open on the ground, some nice ferns. Then the area I was trying to look for, to kind of line it up with the light coming from back that way. It's this little stream. I think it might be hard to do now that the sun's moved a bit though, because everything is just dead back here. So what I'm looking for is basically an area that has some shadow detail but also gets touched on the edges of the ferns and the tree by light. It's kind of diffuse through other trees back that way, so you can see like all these trees have this really nice diffuse light around the edges, which provides great depth in the photo. The hard part is just picking out a composition, and then even when the composition looks good on the back of a small camera screen, usually get back to the computer, at least I do, and there's not many good ones on there. Maybe get one or two. So see what I can find back here, get set up and take a few different compositions. So today I want to discuss a technique that is extremely important for landscape photography, and that is called exposed to the right, or also known as ETTR. So I'm going to show you why it's important and how I use it for every single one of my landscape images. So for example, I'm going to be shooting this scene right in here. So what I'm going to do here is I'll first set up the composition. You can see it right here on the screen. So I'm balancing one side with the really nice light coming right here. And then the bottom of the composition is right here by these bushes. So that light's kind of pushing the eye in through here. And then I'm balanced on the right side by these trees. So pretty nice light coming through, giving me nice defined edges on all of these trees. Should look pretty good. So the first thing I'm going to do, and I'll expose to the right using exposure compensation here in a moment, but first I'll get this shot set up. So I'm just going to use a single point spot focus, zoom in at 100%, and focus on the approximate hyperfocal distance. For this shot, I'm going to go with ISO 64, which is base for this camera, which is a Nikon D810. Then I'm going to shoot at f11. So if I pull up the RGB histogram here, I now have control of it using exposure compensation. So I'm shooting in aperture priority mode. If I go darker in exposure compensation, this bar will drop, the histogram will shift to the left. If I go higher in exposure compensation, the image gets brighter, the histogram shifts to the right. So my goal as a landscape photographer is not to match the histogram on the back of my camera to the scene or the light that I actually see. My goal is to maximize the amount of light my camera can capture, exposing as bright as I possibly can for this scene without blowing out the highlights. And that will give me a whole lot of extra detail down in the darks, which I wouldn't have had if I had a standard exposure. So for example, let's say I'm looking at this scene. So if I look at this scene and I match the back of my camera to what I actually see out here with my eyes by making exposure compensation either go up or down, this back of the camera looks very close to what I see here with my eyes. But what you'll notice if we look really closely at the histogram is that it only goes about 75% of the way towards pure white. So I'm missing out on all of this information that I could expose for up here, but the big part I'm missing out on is all this dark detail down here. So instead of shooting this exposure which matches what I can actually see with my eyes, I'm going to grab exposure compensation right here, and I'm going to move this histogram all the way right until the very right hand portion of the histogram, representing the brightest pixels in the image, are touching pure white. So if I just increase exposure compensation, you'll see that bar goes up and my histogram moves to the right. Now, a few different caveats about the histogram that you see on the back of your camera. If you're shooting in RAW, which you should be for landscape photography, this histogram is actually a JPEG representation. So what the camera does is it takes the RAW file and then it gives you a JPEG review on the back of your camera screen. So the RGB histogram that you see with live view or on image review after you take the shot is actually a JPEG RGB histogram. So what you're going to find is that even though I'm pushing my exposure all the way to the right, making the brightest pixels in the image touch pure white, that doesn't mean that that will actually be the case when I get home on the RAW file, because the RAW file has a lot more detail in the darks and in the highlight regions than the actual JPEG file does. So I'm going to do an experiment and then we can look at these on the computer and I'll show you what I mean. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to decrease or increase my histogram using exposure compensation until it touches the very white edge there. That looks good. So I can see there's a whole lot of darks in this current composition or image, which are represented right here. So that's a big spike in the dark midtones. Then it drops as you get towards the midtones, meaning there aren't many parts of the image or many pixels in the image represented there in the midtones. And then as it gets closer and closer to pure white, representing all these really bright portions where the sunlight's hitting the trees, there aren't many pixels represented at all. So I'm going to take this first image right there. And now that I've taken that first image, I'm going to review the histograms and the sharpness of it. But then I'm going to increase by 1 stop, 2 stops, and then 3 stops in exposure compensation. And I want to see how far I can actually push my RAW file. Since this is the JPEG representation of my histogram, I want to see if I can go 1 stop, 2 stops, or 3 stops past that JPEG representation without still blowing out my raw file. And the only way to do that is to kind of test it in the field, and then you'll know how many stops past pure white on the JPEG RGB histogram you can actually push your exposure and still be good to go for the raw file once you get back home. So if this doesn't make sense yet, it will once I hop onto the computer, so just hold with me a second. So there's that image, looks good. I'm gonna check the focus first, make sure that's sharp, because if it's not focused, the image is worthless. So that looks good. And then I'll just check the histograms. See, the RGB looks good, and remember these are JPEG histograms, and you're seeing a JPEG image here. So you don't actually see the raw file, just JPEG. Can't see that raw file until you get home. And then red, green, and blue look good. All right, so that's exposed to the right for the JPEG file. What I'm gonna do now is grab exposure compensation again, and I'm going to increase this, my EV, by 1 stop. So each of those little tick marks is 1 full stop. The small tick marks are 1/3 of a stop. So I went from -2/3 exposure compensation to +1/3. So you can see that my RGB histogram for the JPEG image is now falling off the edge. I'm going to take this first shot. So now I'm going to increase by another stop. See right here, increase my exposure compensation. My histogram goes even further off the white edge. Now you can see that this JPEG file appears to be really blown out. If I have my highlight blinkies on, they're all blinking. But that still doesn't mean that the raw file is blown out. You can also see my histograms are way off the edge here. So for the sake of it, I'm going to also increase by 1 more stop here. So right there. So when I get home from this trip, I can look at these multiple different exposures and I can compare them, and I'll see how far past my actual RGB histogram exposure, pushed all the way to white, I can get with my raw file exposure. And by maxing that out in the field, I'll know that I'll get a lot more dark detail, and then I can darken the image down anywhere I want in post. So long as I didn't blow out the highlights, and so long as I retain the shadows, I can move that histogram no matter where I want. So capturing images out in the field is all about maximizing the data collection from the scene without losing any of the highlight details. When you get home, you actually want to darken that image back down that you exposed to the right in the field and put that histogram what it actually looked like to your eyes when out looking at the scene. So data collection in the field, at home, putting the histogram where it actually represented for the real scene. So it is around 4 in the afternoon right now. We stopped and shot at that location for probably an hour and a half. Light was really good, but sun sets in about an hour. So we have to really push it to get to camp before it gets dark. It's a pain in the ass bushwhacking after dark. Trail not so bad, but this not easy. But as we were following the river up, kind of got to a place where it just went into straight eroded cliff walls on both sides, so we had to climb up above it. And that's when we got stuck in the jungle. So we were just climbing through that, or maybe falling through that for the last hour. But headed the final stint to camp right now. Who knows how long that will actually be. How's it look?
Pretty good. Pretty big drop. You might want to go around.
Yeah, it doesn't look like there's any way down through there at all. I'll check up here real quick. Here's the spot right here we can get down. Really big tree behind me. Goes way up. Pretty cool. Just moss covered everywhere. Headed straight through here. Woo-hoo! That's the signaling beacon for the right way to go from the leader. Iron Taz. What a good night to be out here. I'm really excited to be base camped out of this area to do some serious exploring of it over the following week or so. I brought one of the pack rafts that I have because I figured we might have to cross the river, but now that I see, how high the actual river is, we could have actually exited on pack rafts, which we did this spring, but it was a lot lower this spring. Right now, it's so inundated with water that there is not that many tough rapids, but it's really fast moving coming out over the river here. Oh, you can actually see the cliff that we had to get up above. Right there's the cliff face. So we had to climb up here, right above that, and then we came back through there. Now we're headed right around the river down this way. Back down to the river. Found a place with a small shoal we could walk up, but I was looking at where these clouds drop down into this rainforest up here, and we kind of have the same thing going on here on the side we're on. But tomorrow morning, just after the sun peaks over the top of the horizon, which is blocked up by like about 3,000 foot peaks at this point, so it doesn't really come up until like 9:30. But once it does, there's usually really nice light rays coming through down into all these forests because those clouds haven't burned off for the day yet. Then each night, clouds start to sink back into the valley again. If you get really lucky like we have, where the day has no clouds and pure sun, you get those perfect forest shooting conditions. It's really nice. Alright guys, so I have the photos loaded up on my computer, and this very bottom photo is actually from next week's video, which is day 2 of this backpacking trip, where we get some really nice light in the forest as well. You also get to see some really nice landscapes that I backpack through, so you can tune in for that next Tuesday. But for today's video, I'm going to first cover these 4 examples that I just shot in the field: the nominal exposure, +1, +2, and +3 EV. And then I'm also going to go through some other examples of exposed to the right techniques and why the specific color in the scene, being the brightest dominant color in the scene, really affects what your overall exposure should be. So we'll look at these images, which are all exposed to the right, and we'll discuss their different colors and how that applies to the actual exposure that I dialed in. So let's first look at these. This first image right here, if I click on it, I hit D for develop module, you'll see that it is exposed for the highlights only. Now I always put these on Adobe Neutral. On some cameras this is called Adobe Flat. That's going to give you the best representation of your actual raw file. When you use like Adobe Landscape or Vivid, it applies way too much color and contrast, so you don't have the chance to bring in that really nice color and contrast later in post-processing. I'd rather start it at neutral or flat profile and then add the color and contrast myself, giving me more control over the dark details. So what we can do is we can look at this histogram, and you'll see that in the field, when I exposed for this, it looked like that and like that. So it was touched all the way to the right. I had barely any left on the side of the darks over here in the blacks. But if I go to what I get back on the raw file, you'll see that it dropped the exposure slightly darker. And now I have room here. The RGB histogram comes up right in here, and it ends right there. And then we have the yellow histogram and the red histogram, which represent the yellow and red color channels, almost all the way up to the right. So if I look at this scene and I zoom in here, you can see that this image is perfectly exposed for the color yellow only, where that bright sunlight hits the edge of the trees. And that's the only part of the scene that's well exposed there. The downside of this is that back here in the shadows, if I tried to pull the shadows out, there's hardly any detail back in there. If I used exposure to do it, I can retain a lot of information back there, but you can see that it's really degraded. It's noisy, the color's not that good, and it's just not a great exposure of the scene. So what you're going to see, if I zoom back out here, is that anytime you're shooting the color yellow, yellow is very close to white as perceived by our eyes. And you guys can reference my color theory photography guide. And this talks about the science underlying how these sensors work and how your histograms work. And it'll help you to visualize this. So if you just Google Dave Morrow color theory, or I'll leave a link right below this video as well. And that's a free PDF you can download and read and take out shooting with you. But essentially, when you're exposing for bright yellow in the field, my rule of thumb is that I push the RGB histogram in the camera as bright as possible, but I don't push it any beyond that. Because you'll see that when we expose for this shot in the field, the histogram looked like that. But now I'm going to go to the next shot, which was a 1-stop increase in exposure compensation. You can see this is at 1/10 of a second, f11, ISO 64. This is at a 1/4 of a second. So it's about a 1-stop increase, about a stop and a third. Here's f11, 64. So the shutter speed went from 1/10 and it got longer. So now we have more light in the scene. So what you're going to notice here is though I push my exposure a little bit too bright in the field, and this is a main example that I wanted to use shooting these trees so you guys would see this. If I go to neutral here, I can come over to the brightest portions of this photo, and even if I drop the highlights down and the exposure, I'm still blowing out this color beyond the point of being able to recover it in post. So when I'm shooting yellow in the field, I'm always taking 2 specific separate shots. I'm taking one for the bright yellow highlights, and then I'll take a second to expose for the dark details. And I'll normally take that second shot around a stop to a stop and a half brighter. Because you'll notice if I go down to this shot right here, which is 2 full stops brighter, I have all this detail now back here that I didn't have on the previous shot. So you can see this is almost starting to look normal back here. If I brought the shadows up a little bit, or the exposure, you can see that I have a lot of nice color and light back in this area, but I'm completely blown out in the yellows here. So what I would have to do is I would have to blend both of these shots together, meaning the one exposed for the highlights and the one exposed for the shadows, to get the shot I wanted. There's no way around that, even with the best dynamic range cameras currently on the market. The D800, the D810, the D850, Sony AR3, AR2, or whatever they're called. Those are really good dynamic range cameras. They can capture the highlights and the shadows, but they still can't get around shooting scenes like this. So you have to kind of know what you're shooting here, and you have to know that if you're shooting for the highlights, meaning really bright yellow or really bright red or really bright orange, you want to push that exposure in the field so it's touching the very edge, but you don't want to go beyond that. So that case is just for yellow, red, orange, those really bright colors, as you learn in my color theory guide. So let's go to another example, and let's go to something that doesn't have a really bright color in it. So let's go to this shot right here. This was taken out on a 10-day backpacking trip in the mountains, and you'll notice that the RGB histogram here is pushed all the way over to the right. So when I was shooting in the field, my RGB histogram actually looked something like that. I had pushed it a full stop and a half past touching white in the field. When I got home, it turned out to be right about there. So for this shot, when I edit it, what I'll actually do is I'll darken it down a little bit like this. And what you're going to notice here, if I darken it down like that and I start to bring my whites up, I can darken it even more. But the nice part about this is that I can pull up this shadow detail. And I can drop my blacks a little bit here. This is just a quick edit. I would take much more time if I was actually going to edit it. But you notice that all this shadow detail down here is perfect. There is really nice color and sharpness all throughout it. And the reason being is because my actual exposure for this scene was way up here. So if I darken this down to what I actually saw with my eyes while out shooting, I still have the chance to pull the shadows way up, and this puts them back where they actually were. So I'm not going to degrade the image quality from pulling the shadow slider up because I captured all that color, light, and detail for the shadows in my original image. So when you're exposing to the right, you're capturing all this dark detail down here you wouldn't have collected otherwise, but you still have the chance to darken your image wherever you want in post-processing and dial it in so it looks really nice in the final result. So now I can use the shadows if I want because I know that all this detail has already been captured. So that is a shot where I'm exposing for like a magenta or a pink up in the sky. So this isn't quite red, but you'll see that red and blue are the furthest right color channels on the histogram. So if we look at this shot, this was taken on another long backpacking trip in the mountains, probably about 7 days. And if you look here, you can see our camp right down here. We climbed way up on this peak to get this shot. But there's my tent. There's my buddy Iron's tent down there. So we're just tucked up on this saddle. So this shot is obviously way too bright when you look at it. When I exposed in the field, the histogram and the shot looked like that. When I got back on the computer, it looked like that. But if I drag this down to what I actually saw with my eyes, something like that, and I could adjust this for a while, but I'm not going to bore you guys with that. But then I get all this dark detail down here, and if I needed to pull any of it out, that's not a problem because I captured that dark detail in the original exposure. Not that I would pull all the shadows out there, but I have the ability to do so because the actual exposure captured all those shadows in the initial shot. So long as you don't blow out any of the color channels or your RGB for the raw file, you can shoot anywhere you want on the histogram, pushing it as far bright as possible without blowing anything out. So my goal is just to expose for the brightest color in the scene. For this, it was pink, so I probably pushed my histogram all the way to the right in the field, meaning right about here, and then one stop past. So something right in there. So your files in the field are going to look really funky, and that's why it's key to be able to test this. Do some experiments before you go out and start using this technique, because you'll notice that all of my shots look horrible. Like you would never want this shot to be your final image. But all I'm doing is I'm maximizing all this dark detail, and when I get home, I can drop it to what it looked like where I was actually out there shooting, but I still have the added benefit of collecting all this dark detail down here I wouldn't have otherwise. So I have really good image quality because my camera is capturing so much more light from the scene. So for this one, I was exposing for like a red. So when I shot it in the field, I would probably had it all the way up to the edge and then about a half a stop beyond. When I shoot red in the field, I push my histogram all the way to the edge and then I go about 1/2 to 1 stop beyond, depending on if it's direct light or not. So test that stuff out, take a bunch of practice shots. Now let's look at this picture. This is from a climb we did. So this is facing the opposite direction of this peak. So here's the summit block on the peak. And here's my friend Derek. He's almost up to the top. So that's the last part of the climb. But you can see we're pretty high up above all the mountains. And this is a huge glacier, which kind of just goes down into another large glacier field. But when I'm shooting shots like this, I'm going to reset this one. So this is a very neutral shot, meaning the brightest color in this shot is white. So what you can do for these, at least what I do when I'm shooting in the field, is I'll push my histogram on the camera in the field all the way right. So it looks something like this. And then I would push it about a stop and a half beyond that. So something right in there. So the benefit of this is you'll notice that this all looks like it would be blown out. But when I get back to the computer, it drops back somewhere in there. And the added benefit here is that when I darken this back down to what it actually looked like, I can pull these shadows up and look how much detail is in those shadows. And there's no image degradation at all because my actual exposure was bright enough that it captured all those shadows in the original shot. So this is the best way to capture images in a way that allows you to retain the most dark detail and have the most malleable image back at home. So here's the last one we'll look at. If I reset this one has red and yellow being the brightest colors. So in the field, I pushed the RGB histogram all the way to the right, and then I just left it there. Because when I'm shooting bright red and bright yellow, I push it all the way to the right, and I don't exceed that because I know red and yellow blow out very quickly. So when I get back to the computer, do that, and then I can move this histogram wherever it's necessary, but I have the added benefit of really nice detail down here that I wouldn't have otherwise. Now the color balance is off on this one. It'll take some work to get back, but I just wanted to show you guys that if you're exposing for any shot, so long as you don't blow out any of the color channels or the RGB channel in the highlights, you can back it back down anywhere you want. But if you underexpose, say somewhere down in here, you can't just create this information out of nowhere. This information is all created by the amount of light your camera sensor collects. So if I were to have a shot that was really underexposed, like this one, I can't just create information back here without getting noise or degraded color and image quality. So you can't just go up like this infinitely and expect the image to be really good quality because you didn't actually collect light information about this part of the scene. So you're going to always have a lot of noise there. So if you guys want to learn more about this, check out my color theory photography guide, and you can always check out my camera sensor size and image quality guide, which I will link below as well. So you're really going to have to practice this stuff. It's not going to make sense until you go over it a bunch of times. And it's really important to learn about how histograms, being the RGB, red, green, and blue channels, work in the field, and then how they work on the computer. Just try to remember that in the field, you're capturing as much information about the scene as possible without blowing out any pixels. And then when you get back home on the computer, you want to move that histogram back to match something that you actually saw with your eyes while out shooting there in the field. So I will see you guys next week on Tuesday. Thanks for watching. Bye.